Protest Movements, a Digital Story, compiled by Kimberly Olivares. This video will compare and contrast African American civil rights movements, feminist movements, and anti-war movements from Vietnam. I'll start with the African American civil rights movement because that is the most important movement of our time. This is the movement that influenced the feminists and the anti-war movement alike. Of the three movements we're talking about in this video, the African American civil rights movement started the strongest. They started with men and women of all ages and kept the movement consistent throughout the years. This movement compares to the feminist movement because it is about equal rights and equal pay for all. Although it differs because the feminists were never segregated, nor were they beaten or burned alive, or had their family put at risk due to hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan in the South. Martin Luther King was essential in this movement. Like the anti-war movement, this movement came from a place of peace. Like the anti-war movement, he wanted to protest using peace, which is exactly what the anti-war movement wanted. The best example and the most popular protest of peace was the Great March on Washington on August 28, 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. This, along with other peaceful protests, led to the signing of the Civil Rights Act on July 2, 1964 by Lyndon B. Johnson. Although this was a big step in the right direction, there were still problems. Whites in the South were still protesting as hard as they could to make sure that African Americans were not going to go to school with their children. The segregation of Southern schools was moving very slowly. In this picture, you see Ruby Bridges attending an all-white school in 1960. She's 6 years old, and she has to be accompanied by the National Guard to make sure there's no violence toward her. In 1966, the movement took a radical turn with the formation of the Black Panther Party by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. They formed the party for self-defense against the government and used weapons as well. Unlike the African American civil rights movement, the feminist movement started small. Middle-class suburban white housewives were influenced by the African American civil rights movement and created their own feminist movement for equal pay and equality for women. The movement started off with the National Organization for Women, called NOW. They formed when women received no help from government leaders or union representatives to lobby for equal pay and protection against employee discrimination. In 1962, when Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was published, women across the country realized why they had been frustrated with the life society said they were meant to have. The more radical group called Women's Lib, or Women's Liberation, formed to overthrow the patriarchy that oppressed women in every aspect of their life, including freedom to take birth control, freedom to have an abortion, and even freedom of who they wanted to sleep with. Unlike the African American civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, the feminist movement had several branches of the same movement. The professional women's group, NOW, the more radical women's liberation group, would not be the only two feminist groups. There would now be lesbian groups, black lesbian groups, along with the newer generation of women that align themselves with the anti-war hippie movement for sexual freedom. The Make Love Not War slogan can be used for younger generations of feminists in the 1960s and 1970s, along with the anti-war group. With every great movement also comes backlash. One group even suggested that feminism encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Wow, that sounds really tiring if you ask me. Feminism has come a long way, but we still have a lot of work to do. In 2011, women are still marching and protesting against the way we are viewed when we wear certain clothes. It really shouldn't matter. People should be able to keep their hands to themselves and not degrade women. Next, we have the anti-war movement. And like the feminist movement, this anti-war movement started small in college campuses. The African American civil rights movement also greatly influenced the anti-war movement, just like the feminist movement. It all started as a protest to the draft. The average age of the American soldier in Vietnam was 19. At this time, it was not even old enough to vote. The American ground troops that were drafted were 80% lower class, since college students were granted deferment from the draft. It was these college students that went on to start the anti-war movement, also creating a peace movement. Just like the peaceful protest of Dr. Martin Luther King during the African American civil rights movement, these college students wanted peace as well. This student putting flowers at the end of these soldiers' guns perfectly depicts the movement that these kids wanted for peace. Also, like the African American civil rights movement, this anti-war movement grew rapidly. This was an all-inclusive movement, including the African American civil rights, feminists, and the anti-war movement. The anti-war movement and the hippie culture stands alone in the fact that a whole counterculture was created just by this movement alone. The African American movement may have started it all, but the anti-war hippie culture ended it all. With slogans like "Make love, not war," and songs like "If you're not with the one you love, then love the one you're with," created a sexual freedom that Americans had never experienced in the past. This movement was so strong that even celebrities joined in. Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, and John Lennon are just a few of the celebrities that came together to make art and music about the anti-war movement. I think every one of these movements is important, but the anti-war movement was like the icing on the cake. What started in college campuses with affluent white youth ended with a counterculture that was so strong that Woodstock was a 3-day peace festival that took place in the 60s. This was at the height of hippie culture, and only 3 short years later, the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam. Works cited in this video are sparknet.antiwar, Britannica.com about women's movement, the Vietnam protest lyrics, feminist readings, and the civil rights readings.